People think the loudest person in the room changes lives. They're wrong. Sometimes, it only takes one quiet hello. The dinner rush always sounded the same at Bellamani Steakhouse. Crystal glasses chimed softly beneath warm chandeliers. Silverware brushed against white porcelain. Expensive laughter floated through the dining room while the scent of grilled ribeye and fresh rosemary lingered in the air. I had worked there for almost 11 months, yet every Friday night still made my stomach tighten. My name is Emily Carter. I was 24 years old, painfully shy, and probably the last person anyone noticed when they walked through those polished mahogany doors. That was fine with me. Invisible people rarely disappointed anyone. I adjusted the sleeves of my black waitress uniform for what had to be the 10th time that evening before balancing a tray filled with sparkling water glasses. My manager, Rick, glanced at me from across the room. "Smile more, Emily," he called without looking up from his tablet. People tip happy faces. I forced the practiced smile I'd worn so many times it no longer felt connected to my heart. College had become impossible after my father lost his hearing and his construction job within the same year. Since then, every double shift helped keep our tiny apartment in Queens and covered his medical appointments. Dreams had quietly learned to wait. Near the entrance, the heavy oak doors opened, letting in a cool breeze from the Manhattan sidewalk. An older woman stepped inside alone. She wore a simple navy coat despite everyone else arriving in designer dresses and tailored suits. Her silver hair rested neatly against her shoulders, and she carried herself with quiet dignity. But confusion lingered behind her gentle blue eyes as the hostess greeted her. "Good evening. Welcome to Bellamani," the hostess repeated louder, assuming volume solved everything. The woman offered a polite smile, but didn't answer. Another employee leaned toward her, exaggerating every word until nearby guests began watching with awkward curiosity. I recognized that expression immediately. It wasn't confusion. It was isolation. I'd seen it on my father's face more times than I could count. Without thinking, I placed my tray on the service station and walked toward the entrance. Every step felt strangely certain, even though my voice rarely did. The older woman turned toward me, expecting another awkward attempt at conversation. Instead, I raised my hands and smiled. "Good evening. Welcome. My name is Emily. It's wonderful to have you here." Her eyes widened instantly. Then something extraordinary happened. The uncertainty disappeared, replaced by a smile so genuine it seemed to brighten the entire room. Around us, conversation slowed. Forks paused halfway to plates. Even Rick stopped talking. I never noticed the man seated quietly in the private dining corner, his dark eyes fixed entirely on us from the moment my hands began to speak. The dining room seemed to forget how to breathe. The older woman's hands trembled for only a second before they answered mine with graceful, practiced movements that carried decades of quiet conversations. "Thank you," she signed. "Most people only speak louder. You spoke to me." A warmth spread through my chest that I had not felt in a long time. My father used to tell me that hearing loss never frightened him as much as becoming invisible. Looking into her grateful eyes, I understood exactly what he meant. I led her toward a small table beside the tall windows overlooking the city lights, slowing my pace so she could comfortably follow. Instead of handing her a menu immediately, I signed each special of the evening, describing the herb-roasted chicken, the grilled Atlantic salmon, and the homemade cheesecake. She smiled after every sentence, occasionally laughing with the soft sparkle of someone rediscovering a language she thought the world had forgotten. Nearby guests began watching without pretending not to. A young couple stopped their conversation entirely. An elderly man quietly lowered his newspaper. Even the pianist seemed to soften his melody, as though the room itself recognized something extraordinary unfolding without a single spoken word. Rick finally hurried across the dining room, forcing an uneasy smile. "Everything all right here?" he asked me. Before I could answer, the woman looked at him politely, then turned back toward me and continued signing. "Could you recommend your favorite dessert?" I smiled without hesitation. "The warm apple pie. It reminds me of home." She laughed again, placing one hand gently over her heart before signing. "Then I will trust your favorite." Rick blinked in confusion, clearly unable to understand a single gesture passing between us. He gave a stiff nod before walking away, muttering something under his breath about wasting time. I pretended not to hear him. Some moments deserve protecting. As I returned with fresh coffee and the slice of apple pie, the woman reached into her handbag and carefully removed a faded photograph. It showed a little boy, perhaps 8 years old, laughing beside a younger version of herself. She touched the picture with remarkable tenderness before signing, "My son used to bring me here before life became too busy." I looked at the smiling child in the picture, wondering where he was now. Before I could ask, she gently slipped the photograph back into her purse and offered another peaceful smile. Across the restaurant, the man seated in the private dining room never touched the expensive meal placed before him. His eyes remained fixed on us with an expression that was impossible to read. It was not curiosity. It was not suspicion. It looked far more personal than either. And for reasons I could not explain, the longer he watched, the more I felt that this quiet evening was about to change my life forever. I could not stop thinking about the photograph. There had been so much love in the way her fingers rested on its worn edges that it made my chest ache. While the kitchen rushed through another wave of dinner orders, I found myself glancing toward her table every few minutes. She sat peacefully by the window, slowly enjoying her coffee while watching the lights shimmer across the Manhattan skyline. It was the calmest expression I had seen on anyone all evening. Then she looked toward the private dining room and smiled. I followed her gaze. The man who had been watching us finally stood. He was taller than I had realized, somewhere around 6'3", wearing a charcoal suit that fit with effortless precision. Dark hair framed a face that belonged on magazine covers, yet there was nothing inviting about the quiet authority surrounding him. The restaurant did not react because he raised his voice. It reacted because every employee seemed to notice him at exactly the same moment. Conversations softened. Servers instinctively stepped aside. Even Rick straightened his tie before pretending to organize reservation cards that had already been perfectly arranged. The stranger walked slowly toward the older woman. She looked up at him with unmistakable affection and reached for his hand. Instead of speaking, she signed something that made his normally unreadable expression soften for the briefest moment. He answered her with fluent sign language. His movements were confident, practiced, and deeply familiar. My breath caught. Whoever he was, this was not a skill he had learned yesterday. He had lived inside this silent world for years. The older woman smiled brightly before pointing toward me. She signed with animated hands, occasionally laughing as she described our conversation. I quickly looked away, suddenly embarrassed to become the subject of someone else's story. A few seconds later, I sensed someone standing beside me. I turned carefully. The man was there. Up close, his green eyes were calm, observant, almost unsettling in how completely they focused on one person at a time. "Thank you," he signed instead of speaking. "My mother has not smiled through an entire dinner in a very long time." I answered without thinking. "She has a beautiful smile. It deserves to be seen more often." Something flickered across his face. Surprise, perhaps, or gratitude hidden beneath years of careful self-control. Before either of us could continue, Rick hurried between us carrying an exaggerated smile. "Sir, I hope everything has been satisfactory this evening." The man's eyes never left mine. Then, without looking at Rick, he reached into his jacket and quietly placed a simple black business card on the serving tray in my hands. There was only one name embossed in silver letters: Vincent Moretti. Around us, the air itself seemed to change, and judging by the color draining from Rick's face, everyone else in the restaurant knew exactly who he was. My fingers tightened around the black business card long after Vincent returned to his mother's table. The silver letters seemed almost too simple for the reaction they had caused. Rick stood frozen for several seconds before rushing toward me, his face unusually pale beneath the warm dining room lights. "Emily," he whispered sharply, "do you have any idea who that man is?" I honestly shook my head. His eyes widened in disbelief. "Vincent Moretti. People spend months trying to get a reservation when his family comes here. You just stood there talking to him like he was anybody else." I glanced across the restaurant. Vincent had resumed his seat, but he was not eating. Instead, he watched his mother as she happily sampled another bite of apple pie. Every few moments, she signed another sentence, and each time, his reserved expression softened just enough for me to notice. It was strange. I had expected someone surrounded by wealth and influence to command every conversation in the room. Instead, the only person who truly mattered to him seemed to be the woman smiling across the table. As the dinner rush slowed, I carried over a small cup of fresh hot tea. Eleanor looked pleasantly surprised. I signed. The kitchen made extra chamomile. It helps after a long day. She touched my hand gently before signing. You are thoughtful, Emily. People remember expensive meals. I will remember kindness. Her words settled somewhere deep inside me. My father had once said almost the same thing after losing his hearing. I smiled and, without thinking, signed back. My younger brother taught me sign language when we were children. After he was born profoundly deaf, my parents decided that silence should never become loneliness inside our home. Eleanor listened with quiet attention. I continued. Years later, he became sick. We lost him when he was only 16. But every time I use sign language, it feels like part of him is still standing beside me. Tears shimmered in her eyes. She slowly reached into her purse and removed a delicate silver bracelet. Before I could protest, she gently fastened it around my wrist and signed, "Keep this." It belonged to my sister. She believed kindness always finds its way home. I immediately shook my head. I cannot accept something so personal. She smiled with gentle determination and closed my fingers over the bracelet. Then Vincent quietly rose from his chair and approached us once again. For a brief moment, neither of us signed anything. He simply looked at the bracelet resting on my wrist before lifting his eyes to meet mine. There was gratitude in them now, but also something much more thoughtful, as though he had just connected pieces of a story he had never expected to hear. I had no idea that someone else had been watching every second of that exchange from the manager's office, and the expression on Rick's face suggested he had reached a very different conclusion. The bracelet felt surprisingly light against my wrist, yet I could not stop noticing it every time I reached for another plate or folded another napkin. It was not the silver that made it special. It was the trust behind it. Eleanor returned to her conversation with Vincent, smiling more than she had all evening, while I quietly continued clearing tables as if nothing remarkable had happened. For a few peaceful minutes, everything seemed normal again. Then the front doors opened, and another group of well-dressed guests entered without reservations. Rick immediately hurried over, greeting them with exaggerated enthusiasm before scanning the dining room for an available table. Every seat was occupied. His eyes landed on Eleanor's table. Without asking me what had happened, he marched across the room and forced a smile that never reached his eyes. "Ma'am," he said politely, unaware that she could not hear him, "we have another reservation waiting. We will need this table shortly." Eleanor looked at his lips, confused. She glanced toward me for help. I stepped forward and signed his message as gently as I could. Before she could respond, Rick interrupted, his patience already fading. "Emily, stop wasting time. We have paying customers waiting." I looked at him calmly. She is still enjoying her dessert. She has every right to finish. My words were quiet, but several nearby guests turned toward us. Rick lowered his voice, though the irritation remained impossible to hide. "You have spent almost your entire shift at one table. Other customers have been waiting for service because you decided to become a personal interpreter." Heat rose into my face, but I kept my composure. I completed every order assigned to me. I simply made sure she could understand the menu. Rick folded his arms. "That is not your job." Before I could answer, Eleanor gently reached for my sleeve and signed, "Do not argue because of me. You have already given me a wonderful evening." I smiled and signed back, "You did nothing wrong. Please do not worry." She nodded gratefully, but I could see the sadness returning to her eyes, replacing the joy that had filled them only minutes earlier. Around us, the restaurant had grown noticeably quieter. Even guests who knew nothing about sign language could sense the tension unfolding. Rick pointed toward the service hallway. "Emily office." Now, I glanced once toward Vincent. He had remained seated the entire time, his expression calm and unreadable, as though he were allowing the moment to reveal everyone's true character before saying a single word. Taking a slow breath, I followed Rick toward the manager's office, still wearing the silver bracelet Eleanor had insisted I keep, never imagining that the next conversation would place everything I had worked for over the past 11 months in jeopardy. The manager's office felt much smaller than I remembered. The cheerful sounds of the dining room became distant once Rick closed the door behind us. He folded his arms across his chest and stared at me as though I had broken a rule I had never been told existed. "You let one customer consume your entire evening," he said. "This is a business, Emily, not a charity." I took a slow breath before answering. I served every table assigned to me. I simply made sure she understood the menu. Rick shook his head. You embarrassed this restaurant. Guests were watching a performance instead of enjoying dinner. I looked at him quietly. It was not a performance. It was a conversation. For a brief second, neither of us spoke. The silence reminded me of something my father once said. People who cannot hear often understand more than people who never stop talking. Rick opened a drawer and removed my employee folder. My heart immediately sank. I cannot have staff making personal decisions during service, he continued. Tonight you ignored instructions, delayed table turnover, and created unnecessary attention. I wanted to explain that kindness should never be considered unnecessary, but I already knew it would change nothing. I simply nodded. If you believe I made the wrong decision, I am sorry for the inconvenience. My calm response seemed to frustrate him even more. He slid the folder across the desk. Turn in your apron before you leave. Effective immediately, your employment here is over. The words landed softly, almost gently, yet they carried enough weight to make my knees feel weak. 11 months of double shifts, birthdays missed, holidays worked, and dreams postponed had ended in a single sentence. I swallowed the lump in my throat, removed my name tag, and carefully placed it beside the folder. I understand, I replied. I reached for the silver bracelet on my wrist, wondering if I should return it before leaving. As I opened the office door, the entire dining room came back into view. Conversations had nearly stopped. Eleanor was standing beside her chair with obvious concern written across her face. She signed the moment she saw me. Are you all right? I forced a reassuring smile and signed back. Everything is fine. Please enjoy your evening. She looked unconvinced. Then Vincent slowly rose from his seat. He adjusted the cuff of his charcoal jacket with calm precision before walking toward the center of the restaurant. Every step seemed unhurried, yet every eye followed him instinctively. Rick noticed him approaching and immediately replaced his stern expression with an eager smile. Mr. Moretti, I sincerely apologize if there has been any inconvenience this evening. Vincent stopped only a few feet away. His gaze moved briefly toward my folded apron resting in my hands before returning to Rick. His voice remained steady, quiet, and impossible to ignore. There has been an inconvenience, he said. You just dismissed the only person in this restaurant who treated my mother like a human being. The silence that followed was so complete that even the soft piano in the corner seemed to disappear. No one moved. The crystal glasses, the polished silverware, even the quiet conversations that had filled the restaurant only moments earlier seemed suspended in place. Rick's confident smile slowly disappeared as he searched Vincent's face for some sign that he had misunderstood. It never came. Vincent remained perfectly composed, his hands resting comfortably at his sides. He did not sound angry. Somehow, that made every word carry even more weight. Mr. Moretti, Rick began carefully. There must be some confusion. Our decisions are based on company policy. We simply expect our employees to focus equally on every guest. Vincent looked toward his mother, who still stood beside her table, holding the empty teacup Emily had served her only minutes before. Eleanor quietly signed something to her son. He nodded once before turning back. My mother has visited restaurants across this city for years, he said. Most people spoke louder when she could not answer. Some ignored her completely. Tonight was different. He paused just long enough for everyone listening to absorb his words. Tonight, one employee chose dignity before convenience. I felt every pair of eyes in the room settle on me, and suddenly I wished I could disappear into the polished hardwood floor. Vincent stepped toward Rick, not threateningly, simply with quiet confidence. Tell me, he continued, which company policy discourages kindness? Rick opened his mouth, then closed it again. No answer came. The owner of Belamonte, Mr. Harrison, hurried out from the back office after hearing the commotion. His expression shifted the instant he recognized Vincent. Good evening, Mr. Moretti, he said politely. I understand there has been a misunderstanding. Vincent remained calm. There has been a decision, he corrected gently. Whether it remains a misunderstanding depends on what happens next. Mr. Harrison looked from Rick to me, then noticed the silver bracelet resting on my wrist. Eleanor smiled warmly and signed several quick sentences to him. Although he did not understand sign language, he looked toward Vincent for an explanation. Vincent translated without hesitation. She says Emily made her feel seen for the first time in years. The owner's shoulders lowered as though the true weight of the evening had finally reached him. He turned toward me. Emily, I have reviewed your service reports many times. They have always been excellent. His voice became firmer as he faced Rick. It appears compassion has been mistaken for poor performance. Rick stood speechless. Mr. Harrison continued. Emily, if you are willing, I would like you to remain on our team. Effective immediately, you will report directly to me whenever you are assigned to our special guests. I looked at the folded apron still resting in my hands, almost unable to believe what I had heard. Before I could answer, Eleanor stepped forward, gently took my hand, and smiled with quiet pride. Vincent watched the exchange without saying another word, but in his eyes I saw something that had not been there when the evening began. Respect had quietly become admiration, and neither of us realized that this was only the first chapter of a story that would soon change both of our lives. The restaurant slowly returned to its familiar rhythm, but something inside me had changed forever. Guests resumed their conversations, glasses clinked once again, and the pianist gently continued the melody that had been interrupted. Yet every sound felt different, as though the evening had quietly rewritten the story I believed my life would follow. I slipped my apron back over my shoulders, still trying to understand how quickly everything had changed. Before leaving, Eleanor walked toward me with the same warm smile that had greeted my hands instead of my voice. She signed, "Will you visit me sometime?" I smiled before answering. "I would love that." A few days later, my day off began with an unexpected envelope waiting at my apartment door. Inside was a handwritten invitation asking me to join Eleanor for afternoon tea at the Moretti Family Foundation. At first I assumed there had been some mistake. People like them did not invite people like me into their lives. Still, something told me to go. The foundation overlooked the Hudson River, surrounded by quiet gardens instead of towering office buildings. It felt peaceful in a way Manhattan rarely allowed. Eleanor greeted me at the entrance with an embrace that instantly erased every nervous thought I had carried there. She introduced me to volunteers who worked with children and adults living with hearing loss. Throughout the afternoon, I translated conversations, taught simple signs to young families, and watched children laugh when they realized they could communicate without speaking. Hours passed without my noticing. For the first time since losing my brother, sign language no longer reminded me only of grief. It reminded me of possibility. As the sun settled lower over the river, I noticed Vincent standing quietly near the garden path, speaking with one of the program directors. Unlike the restaurant, he wore a simple navy sweater and dark jeans. Without the formal suit, he looked less like an untouchable businessman and more like a son who genuinely cared about the people surrounding his mother. He walked over carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. "You have been teaching for almost 3 hours," he said with a small smile. "I thought you might need a break." I accepted the cup with quiet gratitude. "Thank you." He watched the children practicing their first signs before speaking again. "My mother has not stopped talking about you." I laughed softly. "She does most of the talking with her hands." He smiled, perhaps for the first time without restraint. "Exactly." We stood there in comfortable silence, watching a little girl proudly sign the alphabet to her father. After a long moment, Vincent spoke again, his voice thoughtful and sincere. "You did not change my mother's evening that night, Emily." He looked toward the families filling the garden with quiet joy. "You reminded all of us what we almost forgot. The strongest connections are rarely the loudest. They are simply the most genuine." Several months passed before I truly understood that some evenings never really end. They simply continue living inside the people they change. Every Thursday afternoon, I volunteered at the Moretti Foundation, helping families discover that communication was about far more than spoken words. Parents who had once felt overwhelmed now laughed as they signed bedtime stories. Children who had struggled to make friends proudly introduced themselves with confident hands and bright smiles. Every lesson reminded me of my little brother, but the memories no longer carried only sadness. They carried gratitude. One crisp autumn evening, the foundation hosted its annual family celebration in the same riverside garden where I had first shared coffee with Vincent. Hundreds of small string lights glowed above the trees, reflecting across the calm water as laughter filled the cool air. Eleanor stood beside me throughout the evening, greeting every guest with the same warmth she had shown me from the very beginning. She looked happier than I had ever seen her. When the music paused, the crowd naturally quieted. Eleanor gently tapped a crystal glass with a small spoon before stepping onto the stage. Instead of speaking into the microphone, she simply raised her hands. The room fell completely silent. Every volunteer, every family, every child who had learned sign language together watched with patient attention. Eleanor looked toward Vincent first. Then she turned to me. Her hands moved slowly, gracefully, every gesture filled with emotion. Years ago, I believed silence meant losing connection. Tonight I know silence can also bring people home. Vincent translated softly for those who did not understand. His voice remained steady, but I could hear the pride beneath every word. Eleanor continued signing. Emily reminded my son that strength is measured by kindness, not by power. She reminded me that strangers can become family with one act of compassion. Then she reached for both of our hands and gently placed them together. The guests applauded, but it was a gentle applause, respectful of the quiet language that had brought everyone together. I looked at Vincent. He smiled in the same calm way he had smiled that afternoon beside the river. "You changed more lives than you realize," he said. I shook my head. "I only said hello." He smiled a little wider. "No," he replied. "You made someone feel seen." Everything else began there. As I looked around the garden, watching children laugh with their parents without needing a single spoken word, I finally understood something my brother had tried to teach me years ago. The world often remembers the people with the loudest voices, but the hearts that leave the deepest mark are usually the ones quiet enough to notice someone everyone else has overlooked. And sometimes, the smallest act of kindness becomes the beginning of a story that changes countless lives forever.